Welcome, dear friends, to a tale spun from the frosty heart of an English village, where snow drifts softly over cobbled lanes and the air is rich with the scent of pine, oranges, and spiced biscuits. In the square, carol singers lift their voices while lanterns glow like stars against the winter night. Tonight, I invite you to settle in, warm and comfortable, as we begin Murder Between the Christmas Library Shelf, a Miss Marple Mystery. I'm so glad you are here. Tell me, where are you listening from, and do you enjoy these stories? Your thoughts mean the world. The December air was crisp, carrying the soft hush of freshly fallen snow as the villagers of Marleycombe gathered at their beloved library for the annual Christmas carol night. Inside, the warmth of the old building embraced them. Shelves stacked high with well-worn books glimmered under strands of twinkling fairy lights, and garlands of holly and ivy added a festive touch to the familiar corners. The scent of mulled wine mingled with the sweetness of mince pies, teasing the senses as the choir began their first notes of "God Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen." Laughter and conversation wove through the rows of shelves, the village's usual calm only deepened by the cozy ambience. Yet, even amidst such charm, there was a subtle undercurrent of unease, almost imperceptible to most. And then, a sudden, piercing scream shattered the harmony. Heads turned, eyes wide with disbelief, as a body was found wedged between two tall bookcases. The joyful chatter died in an instant, replaced by gasps and hurried whispers. What had seemed a night of warmth and cheer had turned to shock and fear. Miss Marple, quietly observing from a corner, noticed the glances that lingered a moment too long, the hands that trembled at a simple greeting. What secrets, she wondered, were hidden between the library shelves? Chapter 1. Whispers Among the Book Spines. Morning light spilled hesitantly over Marleycombe, glinting off snow-dusted rooftops and casting a silvery glow across the cobbled streets. The village seemed unchanged at first glance, smoke curling from chimneys, the church bells tolling their hourly chime, but beneath this tranquil surface an uneasy energy pulsed. The murder of the night before clung to the air like frost on window panes, invisible yet undeniable. At Mrs. Pettigrew's tea shop, the warm interior smelled of cinnamon and freshly baked scones. Villagers huddled over steaming cups, their breath mingling with the scent of tea and toast. Conversations buzzed with hushed urgency, each whisper layering suspicion upon suspicion. "I tell you, it must have been an outsider," one man insisted, dabbing at a damp mustache with a napkin. "No one from Marleycombe would dare such a thing," another replied, voice tight with worry. In the corner, a group of women leaned across the table, their voices hushed but sharp. "Did you see who was last near the library?" one asked, her eyes darting toward the door. "I thought it was Thomas," said another, wringing her hands, "but I'm not certain. He looked so frightened." The speculation flowed freely, a torrent of doubt and accusation that seemed to grow with every passing minute. Miss Marple sat quietly at a small round table, a cup of steaming Darjeeling in her hand. She listened attentively, her sharp gray eyes flicking between villagers as they gestured and murmured. She did not speak, for the words themselves were a kind of evidence. In the careful hesitations, the nervous glances, the inadvertent slips, she began to notice patterns invisible to the untrained eye. The truth, as always, lay not in the loudest assertions, but in the small, almost imperceptible details. Outside, a crow cawed from the church steeple, its harsh note punctuating a particularly scandalous claim. Just as Miss Marple set her teacup down, a voice at a nearby table broke the hum of gossip. "I saw it myself," the villager whispered, leaning closer. "A shadow moving in the upper gallery after the scream, long after everyone had gathered downstairs." Heads turned, eyes widened. The revelation hung in the air like the first frost of winter, sharp and cold. Miss Marple's lips pressed together thoughtfully. That shadow, an anomaly overlooked in the flurry of excitement, was a clue, subtle yet profound. Something had not yet been seen by the authorities, something that would, she suspected, unravel much more than anyone in Marleycombe could yet imagine. The villagers leaned closer to one another, murmuring questions and doubts, but Miss Marple sat back, her gaze calm and deliberate. In that quiet corner of the tea-shop, she allowed the first threads of truth to begin weaving themselves, threads that would, in time, reveal secrets hidden deep among the village's cobblestones and, ultimately, between the very shelves of the library itself. By midday, the village of Marleycombe wore a thin veneer of normalcy, but the chill of unease lingered in every lane and doorway. The vicar, a kindly man with a gentle voice, moved from house to house, attempting to reassure neighbors that the world had not entirely lost its moral compass. Beside him, Miss Thompson, the librarian, tried to maintain order within the library itself, straightening garlands and arranging chairs, yet even her calm demeanor trembled under the weight of the previous night's horrors. Villagers exchanged wary glances as they passed one another on the high street. The cheerful greetings of yesterday had been replaced by cautious nods and half-smiles. Old quarrels, long thought buried under the polite surface of village life, resurfaced as suspicion found fertile soil. "I never did trust him," muttered one elderly woman about a neighbor she had barely spoken to for years. "And yet, I would never have imagined such a thing," replied a man with a furrowed brow, wringing his scarf nervously. Gossip spread with the speed of wind over snow, twisting familiar faces into figures of speculation. In the library, the atmosphere was taut, like strings pulled too tightly. Miss Marple observed quietly as villagers shuffled from shelf to shelf, eyes darting over titles as if books themselves might reveal the truth. She noticed how swiftly people clung to rumors, how easily a casual suggestion could ignite suspicion, and yet, among the throng, a few remained curiously silent. Their faces betrayed nothing, and in that silence she felt the first stirrings of insight. The police inspector, a tall man with a commanding presence, sought to calm the gathering storm. "We are making every effort to resolve this swiftly," he announced, his voice carrying authority yet betraying a hint of weariness. "I assure you, an arrest will be made soon. Justice will follow." The villagers nodded, some with relief, others with doubt, and still others with a barely concealed anxiety that perhaps the wrong person might pay for a crime they did not commit. Miss Marple, sipping her tea at a discreet corner table, allowed the inspector's words to wash over her while her mind quietly catalogued every glance, every hesitant movement, every nervous sigh. The patterns of human behavior, so familiar to her from years of observing village life, spoke more clearly than any official report ever could. She noted the subtle twitch of a hand here, a shiver of discomfort there, and tucked each detail away as though filing it into the precise compartment it belonged to. Then, with a sudden seriousness that silenced the low murmur of the room, the inspector added, "The library's assistant, Mr. Thomas Greaves, has been taken in for questioning." A hush fell. The villagers stiffened, and the librarian clutched a stray ribbon from a garland, her knuckles whitening. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The first threads of certainty began to intertwine with the fog of speculation, and she realized that the puzzle before her was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Faint Smell of Binding Glue. The morning air carried a sharp edge as Miss Marple made her way toward the Marleycombe Library. Snow still clung stubbornly to the eaves and window sills, glinting like tiny diamonds under the pale winter sun. Though the library doors were firmly closed, a sense of hushed anticipation seemed to pulse from within, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Inside, the usual warmth and welcoming scent of old paper and polished would have been replaced by the faint, sterile tang of investigation. Police tape crisscrossed the entrance, and a constable stood guard, his boots leaving dark impressions on the pale floor. Miss Marple exchanged polite nods with the officer and stepped inside, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the scene. The first detail that struck her was a book lying open, improbably placed, on a shelf far from its proper section. It seemed insignificant, yet in her experience, the smallest irregularities often pointed to larger truths. She noted the angle of the pages, the slight indentation in the spine, and the residue of glue along the edges, a smell faint but unmistakable. Someone had been here, handling books with care, yet in a way that suggested a hurried concealment or hurried examination. Near the main desk, a brass candlestick leaned slightly to one side, as though nudged and forgotten in the chaos of the previous night. Miss Marple bent down, touching it lightly, feeling the cool metal and noting the smudge of dust disturbed around its base. In her mind, she drew parallels between the arrangement of objects and human behavior. Just as a misplaced candlestick could hint at carelessness, a subtle tremor in a hand, or the nervous tapping of a foot, might reveal secrets otherwise hidden. Her eyes wandered over the floorboards, polished and gleaming beneath the soft afternoon light streaming through frosted windows. Then she noticed them, muddy footprints near the staff door, faint but distinct against the polished wood. Curiously, the constable had failed to mention them when she inquired casually. The prints were small, yet the pattern suggested more than a simple walk in and out. Someone had lingered, paused, retraced their steps. Miss Marple knelt slightly, tracing the edge of a footprint with her gloved finger. In that moment, the quiet hum of the village outside seemed a world away. Each footprint, each irregularity in the orderly rows of books, spoke a language only a patient observer could understand. And Miss Marple, with her lifelong habit of noticing what others overlooked, already felt the threads of a story weaving themselves together, threads that the inspector and villagers had yet to perceive. She rose slowly, smoothing her coat, and allowed her gaze to linger on the staff door. Something had been hidden, something overlooked, and she knew that this subtle clue might prove pivotal. Behind the door, a secret waited, and Miss Marple, ever quiet and unassuming, intended to uncover it. The greengrocer's shop was fragrant with the scent of winter vegetables, polished apples, and earthy root crops, a familiar comfort in an otherwise tense village. Miss Marple moved slowly down the narrow aisle, examining the neatly stacked produce while her ears attuned to the murmured voices around her. Conversation, she knew, often revealed as much as evidence ever could, and the villagers were eager to discuss last night's shocking events. Near the counter, Mrs. Bartlett leaned close to the shopkeeper, speaking in hurried whispers. "I tell you, I saw Thomas Greaves near the library just as the scream rang out," she said, her voice tight with certainty. "He was there at precisely the wrong time. I can't imagine it was anything but him." Her eyes were bright with conviction, and Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in her hands, a detail that hinted at more than mere gossip. But across the aisle, another villager, Mr. Pritchard, shook his head vigorously. "Nonsense, Mrs. Bartlett. Thomas was helping with the lanterns outside. I saw him myself, carrying them along the square. He was nowhere near the shelves when the scream came." His statement was delivered with equal fervor, and a few customers glanced from one speaker to the other, uncertain whom to believe. Miss Marple sipped her tea discreetly from her thermos, letting the contradictions unfold before her. One story pointed firmly at guilt, another exonerated the young assistant entirely. She made no comment, simply noting the timing, the gestures, the subtle tensions in voice and posture. Each contradiction was a thread, a detail to be filed away in her mind, where the seemingly trivial often revealed far more than loud declarations ever could. As she continued through the shop, Miss Marple observed villagers leaning close, exchanging glances, whispering as though the very walls might listen. In each exchange she detected subtle clues, who avoided eye contact, who lingered unusually long, who seemed eager to insert themselves into the narrative. The tapestry of human behavior was intricate, and every stitch mattered. Then her attention fell upon Mrs. Lacey, the widow who lived just 2 streets over. Normally composed, she now sat pale and rigid, her fingers tightly clasping a small shopping basket. Every mention of the library, every reference to the murder, seemed to drain the color from her cheeks, leaving her almost ghostly against the warm backdrop of the shop. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Such physical reactions rarely betrayed nothing. Often they hinted at memories one wished to conceal, or secrets one was desperate to protect. Miss Marple made no immediate move to confront Mrs. Lacey, choosing instead to observe silently, cataloguing the widow's reactions alongside the swirl of gossip. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, though the image remained murky. Somewhere among these whispered contradictions and pale faces lay the truth of what had happened in the library. And as Miss Marple quietly stepped out into the chill air, she could not shake the growing suspicion that Mrs. Lacey's reaction might lead to the most important discovery of all. Chapter 3. The Wrong Man in Custody. The cold winter morning brought with it a flurry of news that spread through Marleycombe like wildfire. The police inspector had declared the case solved. Thomas Greaves, the young library assistant, was the culprit. According to the inspector, Thomas had quarreled with the victim earlier in the day, and a witness had supposedly seen him slip something into a glass during the carol night. The announcement left the village buzzing, half relieved that justice was swift, half appalled at the thought of one of their own being accused. At the village square, conversations erupted as villagers pressed together near the notice board. "I always thought the boy was too timid for trouble," one elderly gentleman muttered, shaking his head. "But I suppose we can't know what goes on behind closed doors," replied another. On the other side of the square, a group of women whispered fervently, some nodding solemnly in agreement, others frowning in disbelief. Opinions split sharply, and the tension in the air was almost tangible. Miss Marple, wrapped in her long winter coat, observed the divide quietly from the edge of the gathering. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, noted the quick judgments, the way gossip colored perception, and the subtle cues of fear and hesitation. Thomas Greaves may have appeared guilty to some, yet she could see the telltale signs of an innocence that had been obscured by panic and suspicion. There was a dissonance between appearance and reality that her experience had taught her to trust. Later, she walked past the police station, where the young assistant had been taken. Through the frosted glass of the small waiting room, she glimpsed him sitting with his head in his hands. Soft, choking sobs reached her ears. Miss Marple paused, a pang of empathy stirring in her chest. Then she caught his words, though barely audible over the murmured activity of officers. "I didn't do it. I was set up. They want to make it look like me." His voice cracked with despair, and the sincerity in his tone struck her with a quiet certainty. Miss Marple's mind began to turn over every detail she had collected in recent days. The misplaced book, the faint smell of glue, the shadow in the upper gallery, the villagers' contradictory accounts. The puzzle pieces did not fit as neatly as the inspector's confident proclamation suggested. Something had been overlooked, something subtle yet crucial, and Thomas's distress confirmed her suspicion. She drew a slow breath, smoothing her coat and letting her gaze rest on the frosted windows. The young man's innocence was apparent to her, though invisible to most of the village. And in that brief, solemn moment, she resolved quietly to follow the threads wherever they might lead, for she knew the truth lay hidden beneath layers of misdirection, gossip, and fear. Somewhere within the library walls, the real culprit was still at large, and Miss Marple's steady, unassuming attention had already begun to trace the faintest of paths toward revelation. Evening fell over Marleycombe, casting long shadows across the village lanes and cloaking the familiar cottages in a soft, muted gloom. Miss Marple sat quietly by her fireside, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands, her mind turning over the events of the day. The arrest of Thomas Greaves had left the village abuzz, yet she found herself increasingly unsettled. Experience had taught her that appearances were rarely what they seemed. The truth often hid behind polite smiles, anxious glances, and carefully rehearsed explanations. Earlier, she had taken the opportunity to speak with Mary, the housemaid who had served during the carol night. Mary's hands had trembled slightly as she recounted the evening. "Thomas seemed nervous, ma'am, yes, but not in the way of someone capable of doing such a thing," she said, glancing toward the window as though the walls themselves might overhear. Her voice wavered, earnest and sincere, betraying a truth that Thomas's protests alone could not convey. Miss Marple had listened attentively, asking only gentle, unobtrusive questions. The inspector, however, had dismissed Mary's account as irrelevant, brushing it aside with a curt nod and a declaration that the evidence against Thomas was overwhelming. To the authorities, the case was neat and tidy. To Miss Marple, it was anything but. The inconsistencies in the witness statements, the anomalies she had observed in the library, and now Mary's testimony combined to form a picture far more complicated than the inspector imagined. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the human propensity to conceal motives behind a veneer of civility. People in Marleycombe had long memories, grudges carefully stored, and secrets whispered only when no one else was listening. Miss Marple's sharp mind traced the invisible threads connecting past slights, old rivalries, and simmering resentments. She began to suspect that the root of the tragedy lay not in a moment of impulsive rage, but in a deeper, long-buried conflict, one that had festered quietly beneath the village's cheerful surface. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Miss Marple gestured for the visitor to enter, and a familiar villager stepped hesitantly inside, glancing around as if to ensure privacy. "Miss Marple," the man whispered, his voice tense, "I think you should know. The victim, he had been blackmailing someone in the village. I didn't want to speak before, but I couldn't keep silent any longer." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind immediately racing. Blackmail, a secret kept with threats and fear, added a new dimension to the tangled web she had been observing. It explained, in part, the urgency and desperation behind the murder, and suggested that the motives went far beyond simple quarrels or misunderstandings. She thanked the villager gently, offering a reassuring smile, though her thoughts were already elsewhere, tracing invisible patterns through conversations, glances, and past indiscretions. The puzzle was growing more complex, yet each revelation brought her closer to understanding the forces at work behind the library's shadowed shelves. Somewhere in the quiet heart of Marleycombe lay the truth, and Miss Marple, as always, intended to uncover it. Chapter 4. Shadows of Secrets. The morning sun filtered weakly through the frost-laced windows of Marleycombe Library, casting long, pale beams across rows of neatly arranged books. Miss Marple moved quietly between the shelves, her keen eyes taking in details unnoticed by others. The village, though outwardly serene, was steeped in whispers and secrets, and she felt the faint tremor of tension that lingered like dust in the corners of the room. Over tea in the library's small reading room, villagers spoke in hushed tones, their words more revealing than they intended. Miss Marple listened carefully, noting how often conversation veered toward the victim's financial affairs. "He always had a way of discovering what one owed," murmured Mr. Pritchard, nervously adjusting his scarf. "And he was never shy about mentioning it." Others nodded, glancing around as if afraid their agreement might be overheard. The librarian herself, Miss Thompson, had quietly admitted in private that the victim had threatened to expose the debts of several local families. Small sums, yet enough to spark anxiety and resentment. Amid the chatter, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon Mrs. Lacey, the pale widow whose presence had always carried an air of fragility. Today, her hands were tightly clasped, knuckles white, her eyes darting nervously whenever the conversation strayed near financial matters. "I have nothing to hide," she insisted softly when Miss Marple approached, her voice tremulous. Yet her pallor betrayed a deeper worry, one rooted in fear or perhaps shame. Miss Marple's experience had long taught her that such reactions were rarely without cause. Shame and dread, when left unchecked, often drove people to rash decisions, decisions that could forever alter lives. Turning her attention back to the books, Miss Marple began inspecting the hymn books used during the carol night. Each was carefully stacked, their pages slightly worn from frequent use. One particular volume, tucked near the choir's usual spot, drew her attention. The edge of a page protruded oddly, suggesting it had been hastily replaced or hidden. Gently, she eased it open and discovered a small, torn scrap of paper wedged within the folds. The handwriting was jagged, urgent, and unmistakably threatening. Though only a few words were visible, phrases hinting at demands and dire consequences, the message carried a weight that made Miss Marple's heart quicken ever so slightly. She carefully removed the scrap, holding it delicately between her fingers. The threat it contained was subtle, yet the implications were clear. Someone had sought to intimidate the victim, someone who knew exactly how far their pressure could extend before resistance gave way to panic. This small, hidden fragment was more than paper. It was a clue, a direct link to the motive behind the murder. As she studied it, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a trail just beginning to reveal itself. The puzzle pieces were slowly fitting together, each whisper and worried glance forming a pattern. Somewhere in the tangled network of debts, fear, and grudges lay the key to the crime. And then, as she folded the scrap and tucked it safely in her pocket, her eyes lifted toward the choir's gallery, and she noticed a faint smudge on the hymn book's spine, an indication that the threat had been carefully concealed, yet the hand that hid it had been hurried, almost careless. Something, or someone, was waiting to be uncovered. By late afternoon, Marleycombe seemed to shiver under a deeper, more uneasy quiet. The villagers had retreated indoors, leaving only the occasional footsteps crunching through the snow to disturb the stillness. Miss Marple remained in the library, the torn scrap of threatening letter folded neatly in her coat pocket. Its words whispered of betrayal and revenge, yet offered no clear identity of the sender. She knew well that in villages such as this, motives rarely came singly, human passions intertwined like ivy, each strand tugging at the next. Gossip, that ever-persistent pulse of village life, began to reveal threads that had previously gone unnoticed. From the corner of her eye, Miss Marple observed villagers leaning close to one another, hushed tones spilling secrets that might otherwise have remained locked away. Whispers suggested that the victim had been entangled in a secret romantic affair, the kind of scandal that would make even the most civilized citizen blush, and perhaps seek desperate measures to conceal. Faces flushed, eyes flicked nervously, and even those who appeared calm could not completely mask the tension rising beneath the surface. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the librarian's assistant, Thomas Greaves, who had been hovering near the shelves under the pretense of arranging returned books. Each mention of romance caused him to shift uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, fingers drumming lightly against the edge of a desk. His nervousness could be interpreted in many ways, yet Miss Marple, drawing upon decades of careful observation, noted it as a possible indicator of involvement or knowledge beyond what he admitted. Small signs, after all, often spoke louder than confessions. Meanwhile, other motives began to surface, each one more tangled than the last. Financial disputes mingled with long-standing rivalries, unspoken resentments intertwined with jealousy, and the more Miss Marple listened, the more the village revealed its hidden currents. The murder, she realized, was not a solitary act of violence but a nexus of intertwined lives, each bearing its own secret burdens. To outsiders, Marleycombe appeared quaint and peaceful. Beneath that surface, however, the subtle undercurrent of human desire and fear ran strong and cold. Just as she began to organize these new threads in her mind, the quiet of the evening was shattered. A scream, sharp and terrifying, rang out from somewhere beyond the library doors. It was a sound that froze the blood, slicing through the stillness of snow and firelight alike. Villagers rushed toward the source, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, her mind already leaping ahead. Another attack had taken place, and the ramifications were immediate. Panic, fear, and suspicion would spread faster than the winter wind. Miss Marple's eyes, however, remained calm and discerning. She noted the expressions on each face, the sudden movements, and the instinctive reactions. Somewhere within the chaos, the truth lay hidden, and she knew that to uncover it, she would have to untangle not one, but multiple strands of deception. The night had only just begun to reveal its darkest secrets. Chapter 5. The Second Shock. The night air in Marleycombe had grown brittle, carrying a tension that seemed to prick at every exposed cheek and finger. The streets were quieter than usual, the soft crunch of snow underfoot broken only by hurried footsteps and murmured warnings. Yet even in this tense hush, the familiar warmth of the village lamps gave a sense of security that was rapidly being undermined. For the second time within a week, fear had crept into Marleycombe, infiltrating its cozy corners and sunlit streets. It happened near the library, that cornerstone of the village, where a villager, Mr. Aldridge, the baker's assistant, was discovered collapsed against the cold brick wall. Though the injury was not fatal, the sight of blood mingled with frost was enough to send a ripple of panic through the village. "The killer walks among us," whispered voices spread like wildfire, carrying dread into every cottage and shop. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and no one ventured out without caution. Even the normally cheerful children hesitated, peeking from behind frosted panes at adults who spoke in hushed tones. The inspector, now pale with concern, had doubled police patrols, stationing constables strategically across the village. "No one is to leave the village tonight," he ordered, his voice sharp but controlled. Officers moved with purpose, questioning passers-by and scrutinizing every shadow. Yet amidst the heightened vigilance, Miss Marple walked calmly through the snow-swept streets, her hands tucked into her pockets, her mind alert to subtleties others overlooked. She noticed how some villagers trembled, eyes wide, while others, curiously, seemed almost relieved, a flicker of hidden satisfaction passing fleetingly across their faces. She paused by the injured man, kneeling carefully to examine the small pile of belongings beside him, a scarf, a notebook, and a folded piece of paper that had fallen unnoticed. Through the grimace of pain, Mr. Aldridge attempted a faint, strained smile, his eyes flickering toward Miss Marple. I was going to tell someone," he whispered, voice trembling, about what I found. Something important, before." His words faltered, leaving the sentence dangling in the icy night air. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, connecting threads she had observed but not yet understood. Someone had silenced, or nearly silenced, this villager before he could reveal critical information. The timing, the location, the reaction of bystanders, all were clues, subtle but telling, and she catalogued each detail with a precision that had become her hallmark. The attack was not random. It was calculated, a message cloaked in fear, designed to redirect suspicion and deepen the village's unease. As the constables guided Mr. Aldridge gently toward warmth and medical attention, Miss Marple rose and looked toward the library. The shadows seemed longer, darker now, hinting at secrets still tightly held. Somewhere within those familiar walls, the next revelation waited, and she sensed that the night's events would lead her closer to the heart of the mystery, if only she could unravel the intentions hidden behind fear, relief, and whispered confessions. The fire crackled softly in Miss Marple's sitting room, its warm glow spilling over the tidy rows of books and the familiar patterns of her well-worn armchair. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily against the window-pane, settling in quiet layers on the garden paths. Within the gentle embrace of hearth and home, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in hand, needles moving with calm precision, yet her mind was far from idle. The events of the past days replayed themselves like a series of intricate, interlocking puzzles, each revelation nudging the next into sharper focus. Human behavior, she mused, was much like knitting. A single dropped stitch could seem trivial, almost invisible, yet it altered the pattern of the whole fabric. Similarly, a fleeting glance, a hurried whisper, or a subtle hesitation could distort the flow of a story, leaving gaps that only a patient observer might notice. In Marleycombe, the repeated patterns of fear, deception, and hidden motives were beginning to form a tapestry, dark and beautiful in its complexity. Each villager, she noted, contributed a thread, some brightly colored, others frayed, and some nearly invisible until the light caught them just so. The recent attack near the library had cast new shadows, revealing reactions and behaviors that had previously gone unnoticed. The injured villager, the pale widow, the nervous assistant, and even the villagers who seemed oddly calm or almost relieved, all were part of this intricate web. Miss Marple considered the tangled layers of gossip, rivalry, financial secrets, and whispered threats, tracing the invisible lines between actions and reactions. Slowly, she began to see patterns emerge, connections that others would dismiss as coincidence, yet which hinted at deliberate design. She paused, letting the knitting needles rest in her lap, and reflected on the lessons learned over a lifetime of observation. Timing, subtlety, and restraint were often more revealing than direct confrontation. Patience, she knew, was a tool more powerful than accusation, and quiet attention could expose what forceful inquiries never would. In the warmth of her sitting room, with the snow falling beyond, she allowed herself the rare luxury of contemplation, mapping the patterns in her mind like stitches in an invisible fabric. A plan began to take shape. Miss Marple would not rush to confront anyone, nor would she follow the obvious leads that had already ensnared the inspector and the village in their assumptions. Instead, she would lay a quiet trap, subtle and deliberate, designed to draw the truth out without alarming the guilty party. She did not yet know for certain whom the trap would ensnare, but intuition whispered that the next step must be carefully set, like a single stitch that completes a row of the most intricate pattern. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with calm determination as she picked up her needles once more, the rhythm of knitting mirroring the quiet rhythm of her thoughts. The village's tangled web of lies was slowly unraveling, and soon, she knew, the hidden truths of Marleycombe would reveal themselves, thread by careful thread. Chapter 6. Candles and Confessions. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across Miss Marple's sitting room, illuminating the lace curtains and polished wooden surfaces with a gentle warmth. The kettle steamed softly on the sideboard, and the scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the faint aroma of spiced tea. Miss Marple had invited a small group of villagers for a quiet tea gathering, ostensibly to offer comfort after the unsettling events, but in truth it served a subtler purpose: to observe, to listen, and to unravel the delicate threads of human behavior that often concealed the truth. Her guests arrived one by one, settling into familiar chairs and exchanging polite greetings. Conversation flowed easily at first, the hum of warmth and civility masking the underlying tension. Miss Marple steered the dialogue with careful questions and gentle remarks, allowing each villager to speak freely while she watched for the smallest signs of discomfort or evasion. When the discussion turned to finances, Mrs. Lacey, the pale widow, shivered slightly and clutched her teacup tighter, her knuckles whitening. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the subtle trembling in her hands, the way her gaze flickered toward the mantel, and the brief, uneasy silence that followed her name. These were not the signs of mere nervousness. They were the visible echoes of buried fear, the response of someone aware of secrets that might soon surface. Nearby, the vicar, a man usually composed and reassuring, stiffened when the word blackmail was mentioned in casual conversation. He cleared his throat and redirected the topic, but the fleeting tension in his posture, the sudden narrowing of his eyes, was a clue in itself. Miss Marple recognized it immediately. People often betrayed themselves when words brushed too close to their private anxieties. Other villagers, too, revealed subtle cracks in their polite facades. Some laughed too quickly at jokes about debt or secrecy. Others offered overly detailed accounts of the evening at the library, as though to preempt questions. In each instance, Miss Marple catalogued the reactions, storing them in the quiet recesses of her mind. Patterns were emerging, small yet telling, like faint footprints in the snow that led toward the truth. And then, as conversation turned lightly to the evening's carol festivities, one guest, a typically composed gentleman, hesitated before speaking. His words tumbled out almost carelessly, revealing knowledge of a private conversation and a hidden detail about the victim, something no ordinary villager could have known. The room fell slightly silent, the air tinged with a new tension. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the familiar thrill of recognition stirring within her. This slip, though subtle, was significant. It hinted at access and awareness that only the true perpetrator, or someone very close to them, could possess. The threads of deception were beginning to unravel, but questions remained. Who had spoken? And how far would their attempt to conceal the truth extend before it finally became impossible to hide? That evening, as the hearth's fire cast a warm glow across her sitting room, Miss Marple prepared to take her quiet but decisive action. The subtle slip at her tea gathering had revealed a clue too significant to ignore, and she knew that patience, observation, and careful planning were her most effective tools. Her knitting rested forgotten in her lap as she arranged her thoughts, outlining the steps she would take to draw the truth into the open. The following morning, she visited the police inspector at his office, a gentle smile on her face belying the seriousness of her proposal. "Inspector," she began, her voice calm yet compelling, "I think a little experiment might shed light on our dilemma. You need not do much, only allow me the use of the library for a brief period and to have your presence nearby. It will help to clarify who knows more than they should." The inspector raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across his features. "You mean a trap, Miss Marple? You do understand that we have an arrested suspect, and the village is already on edge." "Indeed," she replied, her tone quietly persuasive, "but sometimes the simplest observations reveal what haste and interrogation cannot. It is not about trickery, merely about arranging circumstances so that truth has no choice but to reveal itself." Reluctantly, the inspector agreed, grumbling that it sounded like a silly old woman's plan, but allowing that perhaps her years of observing village life gave her insight beyond ordinary methods. Together, they devised a careful approach. Certain villagers would be invited back to the library under a pretext, ostensibly to discuss cataloging and Christmas preparations. Miss Marple would observe reactions, noting who seemed hesitant, who displayed subtle guilt, and who spoke too freely. The plan required patience, discretion, and a keen eye, the very qualities that had long made her a formidable observer of human nature. The day of the meeting arrived. The library, garlanded with holly and ribbons, appeared tranquil and festive, though every creak of the floorboards and glint of candlelight seemed charged with anticipation. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically, her keen eyes flicking from one face to another, cataloguing every hesitation, every glance that darted to the corners of the room. The inspector lingered in the background, silent but watchful, ready to intervene if the situation demanded it. As the villagers settled into their seats, a hushed expectancy filled the room. Miss Marple allowed conversation to begin casually, then introduced gentle prompts, questions that seemed innocent yet were carefully designed to evoke reactions. She watched, noting the tightening of jaws, the nervous tapping of fingers, the fleeting shadows of anxiety on otherwise composed faces. And then, as she anticipated, the trap began to work. One subtle remark, a carefully placed suggestion, drew a reaction so telling, so involuntary, that Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. The murderer, unaware of the quiet net closing around them, was about to reveal themselves. Soon, the tangled web of deception and secrecy would unravel before the eyes of the village, and the truth would no longer hide between the library shelves. Chapter 7. The Truth Between the Shelves. The library, though quiet, carried the weight of expectation. Candles flickered softly along the polished wooden shelves, their warm glow reflecting off the holly still strung from the rafters. Miss Marple stood at the center, her knitting bag set aside, eyes calm yet piercing. Around her, the villagers she had invited settled nervously into chairs, glancing at one another and occasionally shifting their weight as though the air itself had grown heavier. Tonight was no ordinary gathering. Tonight, the truth would be laid bare. Miss Marple began slowly, deliberately. "We have all been deeply troubled by the recent events," she said gently, her voice carrying easily across the hushed room. "It is only natural that suspicions arose and mistakes were made. But the truth, as always, relies on facts and careful observation rather than rumor." She gestured first toward the candlestick that had seemed so insignificant, now positioned on a small table for everyone to see. "This was moved hastily," she explained. "A subtle disturbance, unnoticed at the time, yet it tells us something about the person who handled it. Notice the dust displaced around its base. That is not the work of someone familiar with the library's order." Her audience shifted slightly, murmuring softly, some nodding, others frowning in concentration. Miss Marple continued, lifting a small piece of paper, the torn scrap of the threatening letter, its jagged edges clearly visible in the candlelight. "This letter was hidden carefully within a hymn book," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Whoever wrote it believed secrecy would protect them, but they underestimated the small details, the ink smudges, the hurried folds, the handwriting." She allowed a pause, letting the villagers absorb the weight of her words. Then she moved to the footprints, faint traces across the polished floor. "These prints, nearly overlooked, mark a path taken with caution but also with intent. The person who made them lingered near the staff door, retracing steps, fearful of discovery yet compelled to act." Miss Marple's eyes swept over the group, meeting each gaze in turn. She catalogued hesitation, nervous glances, and tightened hands with the same precision she had used in countless quiet observations over the years. Step by step, she dismantled the false assumptions, gently explaining how the evidence had been misinterpreted, how panic and fear had clouded judgment, and how quick accusations had wrongly fallen upon an innocent young man. The villagers listened, some with relief, others with growing anxiety, as the meticulous unraveling of the puzzle continued. Finally, Miss Marple paused, folding her hands in front of her. She let the room settle into a tense silence, the flickering candlelight reflecting in wide, expectant eyes. And then, as if guided by instinct, she directed her gaze toward the one figure who had drawn her attention since the earliest whispers, the widow, Mrs. Lacey. All eyes, conscious of her focus, slowly followed. The widow's hands trembled slightly, and her pale cheeks seemed even more fragile in the candlelight. A quiet, collective intake of breath passed through the room. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, yet her mind raced with the final threads of observation. Tonight, at last, the hidden truth would emerge from the shadows between the library shelves. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room, calm and measured, before settling once more on Mrs. Lacey. "You see, my dear friends," she began gently, "the puzzle pieces do not lie, though people often do. It is the human heart and its hidden fears that can twist appearances and mislead even the most diligent observer." Her voice, soft yet compelling, drew the villagers' attention fully, compelling them to listen closely. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in, then continued. "Mrs. Lacey, the pale widow we have all known for her quiet manners, was faced with a predicament that none of us could have imagined. Many years ago, a scandal threatened her family's reputation, a matter she believed long buried. The victim, it seems, had discovered her secret and sought to exploit it, blackmailing her in whispers and letters, pressing her to act against her better judgment. The widow's trembling grew more pronounced, her knuckles white as she clutched her lap. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle, almost coaxing. On the night of the carol gathering, desperation overtook reason. You struck, in a moment of panic, when the opportunity presented itself. And then, she lifted her hands toward the room, including the gathered villagers, you attempted to misdirect suspicion, moving evidence and creating a narrative that would point to Thomas Greaves, who, as we now know, was entirely innocent. Gasps rippled through the room as the revelation settled, and Miss Marple continued, calmly tracing the sequence of events. The footprints, the candlestick, the torn letter, they were all part of your attempt to conceal the truth. And when another villager stumbled upon a critical detail, you struck again, not with intent to kill, but to preserve the secret you feared would destroy you. The panic, the fear, the attempts at deception, they are all understandable, yet they have left shadows that cannot easily be erased. The room remained silent, heavy with the weight of confession. Mrs. Lacey's composure finally crumbled. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks, and her shoulders shook as she whispered, "Yes, it is true. I did what I thought I had to. I never meant to hurt anyone. I only wanted it all to stop. I only wanted it to end." Her voice faltered into sobs, the burden of her actions laid bare at last. Miss Marple moved closer, placing a comforting hand upon Mrs. Lacey's arm. "The truth is difficult, my dear, but it is always better than the weight of secrets. Now we know, and the innocent have been spared further suspicion." The inspector stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Very well," he said with a mix of relief and lingering tension. "The case is closed." He glanced at Miss Marple, who smiled faintly, her eyes thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Indeed," she said softly, almost to herself, "the case may be closed, yet such tragedies always leave shadows. Even when justice is done, the echoes of fear, sorrow, and secrecy linger in quiet corners. Let us hope the village learns from this, and that the light of understanding will temper the darkness that has touched us all." The villagers absorbed her words, a reflective hush settling over them as the reality of events and the weight of human frailty became clear. In Marleycombe, life would resume, but the memory of that Christmas, and the truths revealed between the library shelves, would linger long after the candles had burned low. Chapter 8. Snowfall over Marleycombe. The first soft flakes of snow began to fall over Marleycombe, dusting the rooftops and church steeple in a quiet, sparkling white. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though the world itself was pausing to admire the gentle beauty of winter. Within the library, now warm and inviting once more, the familiar sights, garlands of holly, polished shelves, and candles flickering in the corners, welcomed villagers back with a comforting familiarity. Thomas Greaves, recently exonerated, entered the library with a careful step, his shoulders still slightly hunched from the ordeal, but his eyes brightened with relief. The villagers greeted him with cautious smiles and polite nods, their whispers now tinged with sympathy rather than suspicion. He offered a shy bow of thanks to Miss Marple, whose quiet presence had guided the uncovering of truth without casting judgment. His innocence restored, he quietly resumed his duties, though the memory of his wrongful accusation lingered like a shadow in the warmth of the festive light. The choir, undeterred by recent events, began to practice for the upcoming Christmas celebrations. The familiar notes of carols filled the library once more, blending with the aroma of freshly brewed tea and warm mince pies. Villagers gathered around tables, sipping slowly from delicate china cups and sharing gentle conversation. Yet beneath the chatter there was a subtle change. Voices were softer, words measured, glances lingered a moment longer with unspoken understanding. The events of the past days had reminded all of Marleycombe of the delicate balance of village life, of how quickly suspicion and fear could shatter even the most charming facade. Miss Marple observed quietly, seated near the fireplace, her knitting resting idly in her lap. She watched faces once tense now relax, yet she also noted the shadow of contemplation behind their smiles. Conversations returned, but the gentle caution in tone and the careful selection of words betrayed a village newly aware of human frailty. The bonds of community, though shaken, were reinforced by shared experience and the reassurance that truth had prevailed. Outside, snow continued to fall, softening the world in white and muffling distant sounds. Children's laughter rang faintly from the village green, and the soft jingle of bells announced the approach of evening carols. The village had returned to its rhythm, restored yet subtly altered, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that even in the most peaceful places, hidden struggles and secret fears lay beneath the surface. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the snow-covered rooftops, her thoughts calm yet reflective. She knew that peace, however fragile, was never permanent, and that the human heart often carried hidden depths and untold burdens. Beneath every polite smile, every tidy home, and every gleaming window-pane lay stories of ambition, error, fear, and hope, threads woven together to form the complex tapestry of village life. Her fingers lightly touched her knitting, a faint smile on her lips, as she contemplated the truths revealed and the lessons quietly learned by Marleycombe. Even in the midst of restored cheer, she knew the delicate balance of life required constant observation and gentle understanding, for every charming surface concealed untold human struggle. The fire crackled warmly in Miss Marple's sitting-room, casting soft, golden light across the familiar furniture and the rows of carefully arranged books. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently against the window panes, glinting like tiny stars in the fading winter light. The village of Marleycombe had begun to reclaim its calm. Laughter and conversation had returned to the streets, and the library, once shadowed by fear, now radiated its usual welcoming warmth. Within the cozy sanctuary of her home, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, knitting needles poised in her hands, though her mind traveled far beyond the simple patterns of wool. She reflected on the events that had unfolded, the Carol night that ended in horror, the sudden attacks that shook the village, and the hidden motives that had quietly driven one individual to desperate measures. Tragedy, she realized, rarely sprang from cruelty alone. It was fear, shame, and the suffocating weight of secrecy that often pushed ordinary people into extraordinary acts. The patterns of human behavior, much like the knitting before her, could be intricate and delicate. A single misstep, a missed stitch, and the entire design was altered, sometimes disastrously. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the flickering fire, where shadows danced across the walls, reminding her of the subtle movements she had observed in the villagers, the nervous glances, the fleeting hesitation, the involuntary shiver of recognition. Each small gesture, she understood, revealed a truth about human nature that might otherwise remain hidden. Even the quietest, most reserved inhabitants could be touched by fear, and even the most innocent could find themselves caught in circumstances beyond their control. As she knit, her thoughts softened. The villagers of Marleycombe, though shaken, had endured, and in enduring, they had learned something essential about trust, courage, and the fragility of peace. The young assistant, Thomas, would return to his work with a cautious optimism, while others carried the lessons of observation, restraint, and forgiveness quietly in their hearts. The village had been reminded that behind every cheerful face, behind every tidy home and friendly smile, lay complexities that demanded compassion and understanding. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to listen to the distant echoes of carols drifting through the frosty night. The familiar melody of "God rest ye merry, gentlemen," mingled with the soft whisper of falling snow, carrying with it a comforting sense of continuity and hope. The season, despite its trials, was returning to its natural rhythm. Warmth within, peace without, and a gentle reassurance that life, though layered with secrets and shadows, could still find its balance. Opening her eyes, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, her fingers resuming the quiet rhythm of knitting. In the stillness of the firelit room, she understood that the world would always hold mysteries, hidden corners, untold stories, and secrets waiting for patient observation to reveal them. The village of Marleycombe was at rest, for now, but in quiet corners of England, in other towns and villages, the subtle complexities of human nature would continue to whisper, and the next mystery was never far away. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us in the quiet village of Marleycombe on this winter's tale, Murder Between the Christmas Library Shelves. Through the flickering candlelight, the rustle of pages, and the hushed whispers of its villagers, we have walked alongside Miss Marple, witnessing how her gentle wisdom and keen observation uncover the truths hidden behind polite smiles and familiar facades. Even in the darkest corners, she reminds us that patience, attention, and understanding can illuminate secrets that might otherwise remain unseen. Outside, the snow continues to fall softly, blanketing the village in a serene white hush. Inside, the fire glows warmly, casting its comforting light over familiar furniture and well-loved books. It is a moment to breathe, to let the events of the tale settle, and to feel the peace that comes after revelation. The villagers of Marleycombe have learned that even amid fear, suspicion, and sorrow, community, and honesty can restore harmony, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage and observation can change everything. And yet, as Miss Marple would gently remind us, every story leaves its echoes. The quiet corners of English villages are never truly without mystery. Secrets linger, waiting for the patient eye, the quiet mind, and the thoughtful heart to notice them. Now, dear listener, imagine yourself in Miss Marple's shoes. If you had been here tonight, what small clue would you have noticed first? Was it a glance, a word, a footprint, or something entirely overlooked? Share your thoughts, your theories, or the moment in the story that captured your attention most. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Until the next cozy mystery draws you into another village, another winter night, remember that even in the gentlest of places, stories and secrets are always waiting to be discovered. Thank you for listening, and may your own holiday season be filled with warmth, wonder, and just the right hint of intrigue.